Welcome to Alter Everything, a podcast about data science and analytics culture. I'm Megan Dibble, and today we're talking about data capture and analytics in the sports industry. Joining us for this episode is Lauren Schwaar, founder of Fathom Performance. We'll talk about the app she created to solve challenges with sports data collection and how better data can improve outcomes across all kinds of sports organizations. Let's get started.
Hi, Lauren. It's awesome to have you on our podcast. I would love to have you introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a bit about where you're from and what you do, what your background is.
Sure. I'm from Chicagoland originally, and I grew up there in the suburbs and did my undergrad in Illinois. So my first experience going to live elsewhere was after school. I then got to do a lot of travel. I started my career in one direction, and it's taken a turn for another and has dropped me more in the data and analytics space, which is super fun. And obviously, we'll get to more of that. But I've been able to live in a few places around the world in my last decade of life or so, and I'm now currently in Denver working on a tech startup in data analytics. I don't think I expected ever to say any of those things, but that leads us to the present. But yeah, I started in Chicago and I'm very grateful to be here.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel that if somebody had told me in college that I would be guest hosting a data analytics podcast, I would be like, what? I'm
Right.
not manufacturing widgets. I don't know. So
Life is crazy.
Yeah, life is crazy, but glad that you're in the data space now. When we chatted earlier, you mentioned that you have a degree in sports policy. So I'd love to hear what that's all about and what you liked about learning that topic.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I graduated from a small D3 college and I played women's basketball while doing that. And during my time in school, I studied communication. That's what I ended up with as an undergrad degree. And during that time, I don't remember, this being a light switch moment, but somewhere in there, I realized I loved everything about what I saw my coach doing, the coach of my basketball team. And I loved everything about what I saw of his lifestyle and the fact that he worked with motivated athletes and he was in the gym all the time and, only had to dress up really nice once in a while for games. And all of that looked really enticing. So I decided to pursue a career in coaching. I was able to coach in the collegiate circuit, if you will, in the States for the next 4 or 5 seasons-ish. So I was able to coach at a handful of small schools ranging from St. Louis to Chicago and then elsewhere in the Midwest. After those seasons, I got a few chances to coach internationally, and those opened my eyes to the broader landscape of sport and how sport worked in different places around the world, and that was incredibly intriguing to me. So when the opportunity came to look for a master's program and look specifically at a degree in the UK that had more to do with sport in an overarching, more umbrella, almost ideological sense, how sport is useful and how it works on a large scale, I jumped at that chance. And so my degree in sport policy management and international development is the full title, which is not really worth saying. It's too long, but that was the degree I ended up doing. And that introduced me to a world of sport for development specifically, which is not a term that's super common here in the States. It's a lot more common in Europe and in other places and in other sport frameworks around the world. And that provided a platform or a bit of a jumping off point for how my career ended up pivoting. I assumed after that degree, I would come back to the States and then jump back into collegiate coaching, and then ended up having opportunities to stay in the UK a little bit longer, to continue coaching, but then to start working in that kind of broader world of sport for development. And that is what then inspired what I currently do. I started a company while doing that degree and then have been working on that ever since. And so now that is more of my full-time endeavor these days. And that has more to do with how data influences sport and sport for development specifically.
Awesome. And can you walk us through real quick what sport for development, what that phrase means, what that encompasses?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because it wasn't something that I knew about before doing that travel and then doing that degree. So I appreciate you raising that. Sport for development refers to frameworks that allow sport to not only operate for sport's sake, but to also create bigger and wider change. So sport for development would refer to organizations or initiatives that use sport as a tool, but then to try and foster whether that might be reducing poverty or increasing education levels or reaching hard to reach demographics or increasing mental health, applying sport to a larger aim or goal in order to move that goal forward.
Oh, that's really cool. Thanks.
Yeah,
And accidental pun there with the goal. We had
you're
another
so right.
we had another episode about soccer/UK football, so it's on the brain.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's really cool. Like using sport as a tool and a means to accomplish lots of different things on top of having a good time on the court, field, wherever. So I would love to hear about what experiences drove you to start your company and how that kind of happened.
I laugh because it was not certainly something that I expected to happen or kind of guide the last several years of my life. But over and over again, while doing that program, we would talk through case studies. We would talk about different sport organizations that were applying sport for development principles in different ways. And that ranges from the tiniest community swimming club to the Olympics committee, as in the IOC. Like that's a huge spectrum of organization types and sizes and influence ranges, etc. So it's a massive ecosystem with lots of very unique and different players. Forgive the incessant puns, but the story over and over again that we continue to see was an organization that had done a lot for its community or that had accomplished some big initiative, or even in the more performance and elite sport sides of things, maybe they set up a big foundation and did a ton of good for their communities. But what they had to show for it at the end was almost always very anecdotal. It usually looked like maybe we had a case study of this one kid who came and said their life was changed because they were part of this program or were able to play with this basketball club or do this thing with this sport organization. But the sports sector as a whole, in the more grassroots community and development spaces, not necessarily elite. So those are those are different breeds within the sport umbrella. But the grassroots and the development organizations, by and large, were not very good at collecting data and to be able to show that the impact that they were making was not just occurring in these very one-off anecdotal instances. So being able to show that it was a representative case, so that this was happening on a wide scale for a lot of the people, a large percentage of the participants that were taking part in these programs, we weren't good at doing that. So over and over again, it seemed like we would just get to this kind of stopping point where this organization would have run this big thing or done something that probably had done a lot of good, but they didn't have the data to show it. And thus they weren't able to evidence the impact that they were making. And so after hearing that a bunch of times throughout that course, I think at some point I thought to myself, there has to be a better way of doing this. Like, why isn't this seems like a problem that should have been solved already. I'm just curious why there's not already something out there. And there are tools out there. There are different software products there. I mean, everybody's heard of SurveyMonkey. I'm sure most of the people who listen to your podcast have made data visualizations in Excel. There are ways of gathering and analyzing data. But those tools are often pretty inaccessible, to a large portion of development type organizations, because a lot of them take a lot of time and manual work to use and implement and then upkeep. And a lot of those organizations don't have the time for that. And in particular, the process of collecting data is difficult for a few reasons. And so a lot of the organizations that we would first have studied while I was doing that master's program, some of which that we have served in the last couple of years with my company, would still be using pen and paper surveys. Trying to get 108-year-olds in a gym to fill out a pen and paper survey is not exactly a fun or very successful job.
Can imagine.
And it is on average very difficult for sport organizations to collect data because there just aren't great tools that are fit for purpose that work well for those kinds of environments. And that's what inspired first exploring the idea and then kind of reluctantly trying to build a prototype. And then I don't really know what happened in between. Now we are incorporated and working towards developing Fathom to a place where it can solve this problem on a much wider scale. And yeah, the last 3 years have certainly been a journey. It feels like it was kind of a slow burn start. And now that is the bulk of what I do day to day, is work on that project.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for walking us through that. And it's really interesting for me, at least. I don't know a ton about sports, but I kind of think of it as like, one industry. But then when you're talking about, well, from the community swimming pool to Olympics, like there's a huge range there. It's like saying in the business world, from the 5-person company in the garage to a major corporation, they're not going to have the same tools and data collection needs and all of that.
Absolutely.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a ton to be said there. And you're right. There's so much variance. That has been part of this journey, is to learn how can we build something that's scalable and that can work for a range of different needs, because there are so many different types of organizations, even in just the kind of the sliver that we're trying to target as we grow. So absolutely.
When you're talking about the value of data for these organizations that need to collect it, that maybe have been collecting it with pen and paper, when you introduce your app and you get them on board with different methods and collecting more accurate data, do you have any examples of the difference that that's made, or what the impact that has had for these specific people once they really grasp that concept?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. The normal environment I think I often find myself in when I'm having initial conversations with potential clients is that one of the staff is really passionate and understands the value of data and is ecstatic about spreadsheets and knows that this is going to be a really valuable thing for their organization. And then the trick just becomes how to get everyone else's buy-in and help the whole organization see that this is helpful and effective in practice. It's been fascinating to work with organizations that at the end of the year, if they're able to see the donor report that they've created as a result of the data they've collected, or if they've been able to see a new grant come in that they didn't think they would get, or for the organization simply to work better, for them to have seen the process of gaining insights via data collection and then putting those into practice and seeing the results improve. I think those are the big success stories that we're excited about, and the ways that data can get itself its own buy-in when it does its job. And there's a lot of finesse that needs to happen in between. Just as much of what we do is currently consulting and helping people design their measurement frameworks and think through, okay, what metrics would actually show what we're hoping that this is doing. Not only do we need to identify the ultimate value we're trying to provide for people and our participants or our athletes, but then we need to figure out a good way, an elegant way, and a creative way of tracking that. And that process often takes some work and some finagling. And so once then you can kind of crack, okay, this is the metric. This is what we need. Everybody in the sector is trying to figure out what metrics actually show meaningful change. And different countries are doing that differently. Different organizations, different sports, different application types, different funding bodies are all trying to figure out, how do we show that this is meaningful, that this is making improvement. And so when an organization sees that put through its cycle, and when that data then actually becomes relevant and gets them the grant or shows their membership increase because people are actually seeing that they're receiving huge value from being a part where they didn't know that before, those are the kinds of wins that we're after and that we want to facilitate more of with Fathom.
It's funny because we talked about that on a previous episode too, with Richard talking about Premier League football, and that was a sticking point for them as well, is what are the metrics that matter most, and even advancing past, once you're able to do the descriptive analytics of, we found our metrics, we put a lot of thought into this. The next challenge is, well, what metrics would predict the best, or like what are the best predictors of future success? So the challenges keep coming, but there has to be a lot of intentionality and thought put into what data you're collecting and then what metrics you are reporting to show the positive change.
100%. And that is our eventual goal. We don't want to just reflect what's happened in the past. We want to be able to predict and suggest what could create even better change and more impact in the future. And we're excited about that prospect. That's down the line. And as we continue to develop our product and develop our offerings, we're excited to try and incorporate more and more of that, because you're right, like being able to know what happened in the past is one step, and that's good. And then we can kind of infer from there. But then, as technology allows us to more and more predict and suggest what would actually move the needle even more for us, that is such a turning point. And I think when that happens, I think that's what's really going to drive a much larger buy-in, especially from sectors that might not necessarily have a big interest in data right now. But if we're able to provide a tool that says, if you do this, you'll get 15% more XYZ, within reason, I suppose. I think that'll be very enticing to a lot of those that aren't interested yet.
Absolutely. And have you faced any challenges during this time of starting the company?
Yes, most definitely.
Softball.
Yeah.
Oh, another sport. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Well done. What a lob. Thank you. Yeah, the challenges, I think some of which I probably partly anticipated, and many others, there's no way I would have been able to anticipate the feeling, the breadth, and then the solutions that we would have to continue to develop. One of the biggest challenges we're trying to come up with solutions for is just the age-old problem of data not being a very fun thing to engage with or to collect in some instances. It takes some creativity and it takes a lot of buy-in for organizations to get the degree of efficacy they need from their participants, from their members, especially when that might be people that come in for a very short amount of time, or it might be young kids, or it might be people who don't speak the local language, which is often the case for a lot of the organizations that we're working with. So there are a lot of barriers to collecting that data and to helping people understand why that's important. So that has been partly a product UX question for us. How do we make this process as low threshold as possible? And we're still very much working on that. The MVP that we are currently serving clients with, it has so much room for improvement. There's so much that we can do to make it even easier to use and more simple and more engaging. We want it to be kind of the Duolingo of surveys. We want it to be very sticky and fun to use and easy to use and clear and straightforward. So there's that side of things. And then there's also an education piece that we're partly responsible for, and then we're partly responsible for equipping our clients to do. So we work with several different layers at once. Our clients might be an organization that then has partner organizations, that then has coaches, that then has participants or athletes. And it's our job to help facilitate that process even via all of those layers. So there's a lot of people that we have to help understand why data and why collecting this information about their experience or about their performance or about the time that they have spent doing X, Y, or Z with the sport program is important. Why it ultimately helps them and why it helps the organizations that they're participating with. So that has been a big challenge. There are, so many others. I mean, a tech startup's maybe almost constant challenge is resource. So how do we fund being able to build our product, navigating that chicken and egg experience, that being we need to be able to produce something of value to get paid for it, or we need to get paid to be able to produce that value. It's tough to navigate some of those dynamics. We also have run into complexities in how different use cases need the tool to operate. And that has been, I think, a pretty classic tech startup experience too. So every client we bring on, maybe they need it to work differently, or they need certain functions that we had done opposite for the last guys. And so now we had to switch it back and try and figure out how we can accommodate those needs too, all the while trying to make sure the platform doesn't break. So it's been tons of learning in a lot of different areas. Language barriers. So, I mean, we're currently serving a client that needs to be able to collect data in 5 or 6 different languages, and none of us know any of those languages. And so working with the tool to not only accommodate that kind of functionality, but then we need to analyze that data at the end of the day. So we use a lot of Google Translate and are working with people who are kind enough to help us translate our questions into Armenian. And so there's just there's
Cool.
lots of, we are doing a good job. It's been fun, mostly fun, sometimes hard, but mostly fun to run into those kinds of complexities and then have to sit down at the whiteboard again and say, well, okay, how are we going to deliver the value that we need to deliver given these challenges or these limitations?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting what you were saying about getting the buy-in from either the people attending these events or even the people hosting the events about the power of the data and what collecting accurate data could do for them. So I was curious to know, what are some things you see as impacts of sports data collection and the difference it allows sports teams or coaches to achieve?
Part of this was inspired by my own personal interest, not only being able to see my own performance gains. I'm a hobbyist athlete at this point. I'm not serious about stuff anymore, but I love being able to engage in working out or lifting. And I was rehabbing a shoulder more than 3 years ago. I mean, this is the very, very first iteration of what then eventually became Fathom was a separate idea for my own self, trying to develop an app to show incremental improvements while rehabbing a shoulder because it was hard to see any performance gains doing little, 5-pound weight exercises that didn't seem like they were doing anything. So I thought to myself, I want to gamify this and be able to motivate myself to be able to engage with this more. And from there, all the way through to now where we are, getting to see how data affects different spaces in different organizations in different ways. But there are big themes. One of them would be the opportunity and then the information necessary to improve over time. I mean, that's now a huge core motivation for Fathom and what it does. If an organization doesn't just operate on assumption, which many do. I mean, we all kind of assume that, well, if I work out, I'll probably get stronger. If our sales team makes calls, they should hopefully make sales eventually, and then if these kids spend time in the gym, we think it's going to do something good for them. But if you don't actually know what that picture looks like, not only are you not necessarily sure that that's actually happening, but you then don't have a solid enough or a clear enough picture to be able to improve on those results. And so that's what we want to equip organizations to do. And we do see that play out over and over again, and not just with the clients that we're serving, but in the landscape as a whole. One of the biggest ecosystems or relationships that we are hoping to help positively influence is that between a funding body, like a philanthropic organization that provides resource, and then the organizations that they fund. So it's in the best interests of those that are doling out money to make sure that those organizations are equipped to be able to make the change that they think they'll be able to. And when you have a better picture of how that's happening, whether it's on a small scale or a wider scale, then you have something to work from as far as being able to improve those results and support those organizations as they do their work. So that's a huge part of what we want Fathom to facilitate, is that process of mapping out current happenings rather than just making decisions based on assumption. And so then from that point, having a starting block to then even make those results even more powerful. So when a sport organization actually has data from the previous season as to what those kids' experiences were, what kind of feedback they might have about how different components of their programming affected them or felt or were beneficial or not, etc. If they're able to get information from parents, if they're able to answer questions about their facilities or their coaching staff, find out from different stakeholders what their actual experience is, that makes it possible for them to increase and improve experiences across the board. And a huge area that we see that most practically applied is in the space of being able to get and maintain funding. A lot of our clients and the markets that we target are organizations that depend on having funding available, and those are usually through grants and donors and other ways of soliciting funding so that they can do their work. Often because they're working with vulnerable populations of various kinds and they don't have resources amongst their membership to make those things happen. So when an organization is able to show that, yes, here are the concrete results of our data collection and analysis that prove that we have been making these enhancements or impacts within the communities that we serve, it makes it so much easier for them to seek funding and to secure it and then to secure their operations going forward. So getting to watch that and know that that's a pivotal part of an organization's survival is a huge part of what we're trying to help facilitate.
That's really awesome and really huge, I'm sure, for these organizations. And interesting too, like hearing you give that answer, there are so many little pieces that could be applicable to all kinds of organizations as well. Just the concept of running on intuition or running on gut feeling or whatnot, especially when it's a small team. The difference that having the data to say, here's where we're at now, and here's how we made progress, and here are our goals, allows you to really communicate the value, communicate the direction, and kind of get people on your team.
Mm-hmm.
Another
Absolutely.
data pod. Or another
good.
sports pod.
Megan, you're rolling it out.
They're just flowing today. But anyway, yeah, that can help get people on your team and on your side faster, and you can accomplish more. So I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then another question I wanted to ask you was, I would love to hear about your passion for inclusivity in sports. I've heard you talk about it before. So, and along with that, just understanding if there are ways that better data could promote more inclusivity.
Absolutely. That is an upfront and growing priority for the sport for development space. And amongst other, there are kind of big forefront themes, and people would probably feel generally aware of a lot of the attention perhaps or the initiatives or the ways that certain areas are being approached, that gender inclusion in the workplace or equity in different spheres in politics and in communities and in leadership in various spaces. That is a forefront priority for a lot of people. And there are other areas too where sport is trying to take a very forefront stance, in sport for development specifically is trying to help propel some of these initiatives and values into community and society as a whole. And inclusivity is a big place for that right now. A lot of the work that we have done over the last 6 months to a year has included a lot of work with specific inclusion focused initiatives and grants. So we're working, for instance, with a large grant that was given to an Australian sport federation specifically to improve swimming opportunities that are available to those with different abilities. So people who may not normally be able to access conventional swimming programs or clubs or teams. That money was specifically allocated to creating pathways for differently abled swimmers and athletes and children through adults to access that activity.
It's awesome.
And that kind of work, yeah, it has to be a very intentional approach, and it needs to be a priority to really be able to be done effectively, I think. But there are lots of different inclusive or more inclusion oriented initiatives and endeavors throughout the sport for development scene. There are a lot of organizations that explicitly target getting women and females involved in sport, a lot that encourage women and females to pursue leadership in sport, pursue coaching in sport, or pursue other leadership space or positions, I guess, within sport spaces. Those are particularly near and dear to my heart. So I love working with young female coaches or female athletes who might be interested in coaching. So those are spaces and I think endeavors that the sport for development space very much highlights and likes to be able to propel. So the impact of data on moving inclusion forward does start with kind of what we were talking about before a little bit. That being, there are many spaces where organizations work on assumption and or they might not take into account what is actually happening on the ground. So there's a huge range of levels of awareness and levels of overt inclusivity. And for organizations that aren't as aware or aren't as intentional about trying to create spaces that are overtly welcoming and intentional and that even prioritize involving people who would not normally necessarily feel welcome in sport spaces, there's a ton of growth to be done and awareness and education that would help propel that process. And a lot of that starts and is facilitated by data and better awareness of what's happening. So that could look like we might have worked with a community football club in the UK somewhere who wanted to increase their female participation and weren't quite sure how to do that. So you start with asking females in the community why they aren't currently playing football, for instance, or what they might need in order to feel more welcome to play football. And organizations that have started using that approach, that being, let's actually find out. I mean, data is just a way of answering questions and learning about what's actually happening. And if you are able to start from there, rather than just assuming, well, maybe we just need to hire a female coach. Maybe, but maybe that's not what would actually change the game, if you will. And starting with a data-based and evidence-based approach to solving those problems will just ensure a much higher likelihood of whatever solutions you ultimately come up with actually changing the status quo and creating more environments where those minority members of your community, whoever they might be, to be able to participate. So we've been able to work with a number of organizations that have used different tactics to try and get all kinds of groups and demographics involved in sport that might not have ever felt welcome or felt like they could before. Now that ranges from senior populations, and older individuals getting involved in sport again, to differently abled, to those that are coming from higher poverty or higher crime neighborhoods and communities, to those who are asylum seekers and immigrants, or who don't speak the local language, as I mentioned before. How do you make those demographics feel comfortable in spaces where they might have not entered before? But that's a huge priority for the Sport for Development community, and data will help that. And it's been cool to see how that has opened eyes for people and been able to propel some of those initiatives to much greater success than they might have experienced otherwise.
Thanks so much for that answer. So the last question I wanted to ask you to finish on was just, what makes you excited about the future of the sports landscape?
Well, my personal vendetta is to see women's basketball take over the world and just to be the most popular sport everywhere. I personally, I love what sport can do. And I grew up intrinsically realizing, or I think experiencing, that sport could create a lot of beneficial outcomes for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's as far as the rhetoric goes here in the States. Oftentimes, we say sport is good for kids. It teaches them work ethic. It teaches them teamwork. It teaches them to be responsible and to pursue goals, etc. And all those things can be true. I think the Sport for Development community has done a good job of starting to air out the reality that sport isn't always completely good, not always been super healthy for people involved. And I know friends and communities and entire populations that have not always benefited from sport and have actually been harmed by it. And so to see the ways that sport as an industry, as a sector, is trying to correct that, and not everyone, but there are a lot of people that really care about moving that forward and getting sport to a better, more healthy place. And I think because of that, we're learning slowly how to be a lot more aware of the effects that sport can have, both good and bad, and to be much more aware of the power that sport has in either direction is, I think, the only way forward as far as making the sport landscape as a whole a much more healthy and good and positive space. So that's something that I'm really excited about, that the awareness of sports power and poignancy is becoming a little bit more forefront in the conversation. So I think I'm very encouraged by the number of organizations that do a really good job of increasing awareness about that. Let's teach our coaches how to coach in a trauma-informed way. I was just involved in a training on that a week ago and listening to really passionate, qualified professionals sharing about how the coach process needs to be more trauma-informed and to approach the fact that people come in with different experiences and experience sport in different ways, and how to best handle that and make a safe space for people. The fact that there are so many initiatives out there that are making those ideas and concepts more widely available is really encouraging, and I'm excited about that becoming more widespread. I miss coaching, and I'd love to eventually get back to that, but overall, I'm excited to see where sport can go and how it can kind of correct itself kind of at an individual level and more at a widespread level. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I love that. It's been so awesome to have you on our podcast in such a informative and also interesting, entertaining discussion. So thanks so much for sharing your experiences with your app, with sports and data, and the change that makes you excited to keep going. So
absolutely. That's my pleasure.
Yeah. It was great to chat with you, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Thanks for listening. To check out resources mentioned in this episode, head over to our show notes on community.alteryx.com/podcast. Catch you next time.